back in 2016, I think especially those of us who are in the conservative media space started experiencing the censorship. I confess, I kind of dismissed people's complaints about, oh, I'm getting censored on then Twitter, I'm getting censored on Facebook at first, because we'd never experienced that. All of these big tech platforms were kind of the Wild West. It was a meritocracy. It was kind of cutthroat. It was really fun. Then some people started complaining about, oh, my tweets are being, suppressed. My post is invisible on Facebook. And I'm like, yeah, maybe you're just not that interesting. Who knows? And I kind of downplayed it until, again, and I'm saying mea culpa now because I was wrong, until it happened to me, until Facebook would notify me that my posts were being unboosted, whatever the opposite of boosted is. They were being penalized. I was being stifled in the algorithm. Then, of course, we had stuff happen on YouTube where I'd get strikes and my channel would be shut down just for talking about regular stuff that, of course, the left doesn't like. Fast forward to 2020, it was the Hunter Biden laptop story, just outright silencing of a report about the family of the presidential candidate. Any dissent from the COVID narrative, you got booted absolutely from these big tech platforms. So my question for this segment is, what do you see on tap for 2024 when it comes to censorship? And you can tie your answer to that question into this larger picture of, okay, here's the point of censorship, whether it's because they hate us personally, they hate our beliefs, or it seems like you're suggesting that this is a larger globalist thing.
Yeah, it's not really a right-left thing. I don't want to say at all, but almost at all, in the sense that this is really about what we call the foreign policy establishment.
So what do you mean by that when you say that?
So we have an American homeland where we live, and we have an American empire, which is basically almost every other country, save a few others, that are effectively political vassal states, or that we exert influence on so that we can secure natural resources there, so that we can have the oil, the gas, the lithium, the cobalt, the aluminum, the gold, the diamonds, the copper, so that we can have trade markets, so that we have export zones for Walmart and for Microsoft and Apple and for Google IT products. We have this international finance system. We have both parties of Republican and Democrat have always sort of come from this foreign policy establishment in terms of their rise to power, and have always been vetted by these institutions, and they have international interests. Most major U.S. companies, almost all major U.S. companies, are primarily multinational companies in the sense that the U.S. may be their largest market in terms of the pluralism of markets, but most of their profit comes from abroad. So they are reliant on the U.S. federal government and our foreign policy establishment. These are places like the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, in order to influence events in foreign countries to make them more malleable to U.S. interests, in order to have them buy goods and services that come from the U.S., in order to stop the rise of legislation in foreign countries that might nationalize an industry or dramatically change how profitable it is to operate there. They rely on the U.S. State Department to put pressure on foreign countries in order to preserve their markets. And that is both a Republican and a Democrat thing. The thing is, there is a Republican civil war between the sort of MAGA populist nationalist faction on the one hand and the internationalist faction on the other hand. This is what I often call the blob. This is a term that came from the Obama White House to refer to how the Obama White House felt that this foreign policy establishment was this sort of big alien blob-like creature within Washington that was more powerful than the White House itself. I think that's a very useful thing for people who support Donald Trump or for people who are centrist to sort of understand that even the Obama administration, a left-wing Democrat administration, felt that this force was the same. And you see these same Republican actors in this. You see the George Bush family. You see the Dick Cheney types, the Liz Cheney types. But just because it's bipartisan doesn't mean it's
like the
inclusive.
uniparty. Not really
Right.
Bipartisan. It's just like they all have the same goal.
So what you have in the censorship industry are Republicans from that general Michael V. Hayden, sort of Bush Cheney defense, diplomacy, intelligence axis, who are selectively exploiting these sort of Democrat shibboleths about what should be censored in order to win the intra-party civil war against the MAGA faction of the GOP. This is why you see places like the McCain Institute and the Bush Institute playing major roles in the censorship industry, getting millions of dollars of government funding to do censorship work. This is why you see CIA cutouts, like the National Endowment for Democracy's International Republican Institute, getting millions of dollars to do internet censorship work, even though it's Republican, but they are targeting the MAGA populist nationalist Republicans here in the U.S., as well as right-wing populist groups all over Europe and South America.
So wait a second. Let me ask you a question, because I'm tracking on everything you're saying here. I'm following along. And I guess my question is the problem here that the State Department is using these tools that they may deploy against foreign countries, even to manipulate elections or foreign economies, which, to be honest, I'm no neocon, don't get me wrong, but I don't have a ton of problem with that. I don't have a huge problem with that because everyone does it. Kind of just is fact of political life. It's always been done. Is the problem here that it's being deployed against us domestically versus just internationally?
That is the problem. Well, there's two problems now. One is that it's deployed against us domestically. The other is that U.S. tech platforms are being caught in this proxy war around the world. For example, in Brazil, there's a little known history about the story of censorship in Brazil, which is that the censorship ecosystem in Brazil was almost entirely created by the United States State Department and its partners in USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, which also get their pass-through funding from the State Department, in the sense that all of these Brazilian censorship ecosystem players, all of the universities dedicated to it, all of the legal and judicial clerks for the censorship court, the TSE, the fact-checker networks, the disinformation wings of major media institutions in Brazil, a whole coterie of it. Tens of millions of dollars have flowed into it directly from the U.S. State Department to target U.S. platforms. And Elon Musk right now is caught in a proxy war between the blob and populism because they wanted to get rid of Bolsonaro, who was a right-wing populist. Just like they're going after Elon Musk and Rumble all over the EU. The State Department has been working with the EU for this Digital Services Act, which is effectively the NATO censorship law, and they want to make all the right-wing populist parties there, Nigel Farage in the UK, Marine Le Pen in France, the Vox Party in Spain, the AfD Party in Germany, the Matteo Salvini's movement in Italy, all of them inhospitable, unable to share their messages on social media, and so they are pushing foreign governments to pass their own censorship laws in order to do a proxy attack on the thing that's their biggest threat, which is losing elections. And this is not a new story, by the way. This is how censorship really came to the U.S. in a big way. In 2017, these State Department diplomats began doing international roadshows to Europe. They ran back the same roadshow they did for sanctions on Russia after Crimea in 2014. In 2017, they ran back that roadshow for censorship laws rather than sanctions laws in order to stop the rise of the right-wing populist parties there. At the time, they were concerned about the Brexit domino, that there'd be Frexit and Gregxit and Italexit and Spexit if other parties won the same way Brexit did. And so social media was really the biggest threat to NATO, the biggest threat to the EU, in some sense, the biggest threat to the international monetary system. And so this is how you have these kind of big international players like the State Department, the Defense Department, and even places like the CIA playing a highly, highly active role in internet censorship, but they're glued together in that uniparty way, where they'll also go after left-wing populists. Like they will go after Jeremy Corbyn, in the former.
Oh yeah, or didn't they
Party.
censor Bernie Sanders to a certain extent?
Yeah, they
when he was going
they
against
were targeting
Hillary Clinton?
Bernie Sanders.
So I'm missing one link. Fill in this missing link for me. So you describe how the CIA or the State Department has always had a vested interest in controlling the speech in other countries because of an economic interest that the United States has, and how you can argue that that's proper or improper, but it's definitely different than deploying that apparatus of censorship against the American people. But did that former institution, or did the CIA, the State Department, this blob that had this apparatus to target foreign countries, did it become corrupted with leftist ideology domestically, and then they just harnessed that existing tool against conservatives domestically? Or I'm missing the bridge that connects the two things together.
Well, again, I wouldn't even really so much refer to it as leftist ideology. You're going to have this same apparatus censoring leftist voices in Ukraine who oppose Zelensky, or leftist voices who oppose, leftist voices who oppose a sort of right-wing institution or political force that's in good standing with the blob. What happens is these issues, these terms of service policies, get selectively either censored or boosted depending on whether they are good for the blob's financial interests.
So how, then explain to me this. How is it good for the blob's financial interests to have Brazil be communist?
Well, Bolsonaro was said to be a right-wing populist threat to democracy. He had a lot of flare-ups, shall we say, with the international financial system. Famously, he kicked the IMF out of the country. The IMF actually closed down its office and moved. This is the International Monetary Fund, the gangster banksters that are, if you've ever read a book like Confessions of an Economic Hitman, in terms of understanding, how deep the State Department and its diplomacy axis serves as a debt enforcement collector for the IMF and other industrial players. But Bolsonaro was a threat to financial interests. He was a threat to. He was deemed to be the Trump of the tropics. That's literally.
So it's basically a top-down thing, is what I'm hearing you're saying. You can correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but you're saying that this globalist blob, some in the United States, some even outside of the United States, want control. The best way to control a country is through Marxism or communism, just complete control. That trickles down to free speech. And in order to enrich themselves, these are the people that go war hunting and want to pillage countries just to profit themselves, even while harming millions of people. It's that's sort of where the ideological crossover happens.
Yeah, and again, I don't see it as a Marxist communist thing. This is a neoliberal thing. This is the fusion of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Take Ukraine. The censorship operation in Ukraine, our censorship that we live under in the United States, was first created to deal with the Ukraine problem. So let me explain this. The military began, we've had 70 years of free speech diplomacy. We've loved, free speech was not something in the 1940s that was as pumped up as it is now in terms of a national norm. We had a First Amendment, but there were all sorts of laws about what could be shown, in the movies. There were all sorts of decency laws. There were all sorts of restrictions on that. But the internet was a way to pipe influence into foreign countries to carry on our open society doctrine. And this is this idea that after the nature of war changed after World War II, after territorial acquisition by military occupation was outlawed under international law in 1948, the military, the State Department, the intelligence services had to move to a new modality of empire. Instead of military occupation like we had over the Philippines from the 1910s to the 1930s, we had to have a political vassalage system, which meant we needed to influence the hearts and minds in order to influence the elections, in order to control the politicians, or in order to have our politician, our State Department favored politician, win. And so we began what we call free speech diplomacy. That is, all sorts of pressure, all sorts of influence, all sorts of cash bribery from the State Department or USAID or CIA pass-throughs in order to open up societies so that they have free and independent media. The State Department does not recognize foreign elections unless there's free and independent media. But that is a cudgel for us to be able to pipe in our messaging into the system. Because if you don't have free speech in a country, if it's closed off from U.S. influence. And so, I don't have a problem with this, by the way. I think this is, an open society is a good thing. But the problem is that it began to be a little too open, because the free and open internet, which was the darling of the Pentagon and the CIA and the State Department for its first 15 years, from 1991 to 2016, free speech on the internet was one of the most precious things to the blob that there could be. It was seen as a way to effectively turbocharge the efficacy of things like color revolutions. If you remember the Arab Spring, which was highly touted by the U.S. media, where the governments of Tunisia and Egypt and all these adversary states opposed that were deemed authoritarian by the U.S. State Department and the Obama administration, all were toppled one by one in Facebook revolutions and Twitter revolutions. Now, those accounts and organizers happen to have training by CIA back channels like the National Endowment for Democracy, who spent millions of dollars basically organizing and training them about how to set up Facebook pages and use these hashtags and where to coordinate. But the fact is that was all, free speech was an instrument of U.S. statecraft. The problem was in 2014 when when we overthrew the government of Ukraine, and we can talk about whether that characterization is correct or not. I think
pretty
Victoria
correct.
Nuland confessing to $5 billion in funding to the group that did it, and then personally handing out cookies and water bottles as they were throwing Molotov, to them as they were throwing Molotov cocktails in cop cars and surrounding the Parliament building in a January 6th style, insurrection against a democratically elected government. The problem is what happened in the aftermath of the 2014 Ukraine coup is what created the censorship apparatus we currently have, because NATO was not expecting what happened next. They thought they'd put Yatsenyuk in power in Ukraine, and then it would, the whole thing would fall to U.S., EU political vassalage. But what happened instead was the entire eastern half of the country broke away. The Donbass broke away. Crimea broke away, and even voted in an independent referendum to join the Russian Federation. And so NATO said, we've pumped billions of dollars into this, and the entire eastern side of the country is not buying our propaganda. We can't turn it up anymore. We're not penetrating Crimea despite pumping so much in there. We need a mechanism not just to turn our own voice up, but to turn their voices down so that they can't have this robust messaging. They can't access this peer-to-peer communication architecture that they're exploiting to get their own points across. And so this censorship industry really started as this kind of experiment in Central and Eastern Europe. In Germany, which was said to be a major trading partner on gas in particular with Russia, Germany, Ukraine, the V4 countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all the Baltics. That was this zone that NATO set up these centers of excellence for internet censorship in from 2014 to 2016, and then Brexit happened, and then it came to Western Europe, this hybrid warfare doctrine they called it, and then the Trump election happened, and then all bets were off. Suddenly this became necessary to save the world to have this censorship apparatus. But again, Ukraine is a right-wing state. Ukraine, remember, the Azov Battalion, for example, one of the largest fighting forces that is at the front lines of the war against Russia, was actually declared by Democrats in 2014 to be a dangerous organization, effectively a sort of white supremacist terrorist group, a Nazi group, and there was a ban on funding going to them. Facebook banned them as a dangerous group because they were as hard right, as far right as they can be. But then what happened? This counter coup broke out in the Donbass and Crimea, and then in 2022, Russia physically invaded the specific territory in Ukraine that is the site of so much of the hydrocarbons that NATO is after in the Donbass. And so Azov became useful to the blob. So this hardcore right-wing Nazi group had all of its sins cleansed. It was uncensored by Facebook. Facebook took them off of the dangerous groups. They don't even have elections anymore. They've not held an election in 4 years, and partly is because Zelensky is down 10 points in the poll to one of the major opposition folks. So they don't want to have an election in case their puppet might lose. But this and several other examples around the world, I think, reveals that you're up against something actually a lot more terrifying than left-wing Marxism communism. You're up against this highly malleable financial system, which will selectively pump up Marxism if it wants to unseat. It will sponsor Antifa if a right-wing populist is rising to power. It will sponsor these communist or these BLM-style, street mafia groups in order to unseat a right-wing populist group. But they will sponsor Nazi groups. They will sponsor hardcore right-wing nationalist groups in order to unseat a left-wing communist or a left-wing populist group who opposes NATO or the State Department from their left-wing flank.
So I think this is complicated, right? I think I'm starting to track through all of this stuff. So you're basically saying that it wasn't necessarily that this blob wanted to endorse free speech because they ideologically believe that speech should be protected. It's that they thought this new channel of internet, by calling it free speech, they could use it to control these different happenings around the world. And then when their opposition also started using the same tactic, using the free and open internet to counter protest or have these revolutions, they were like, wait a second, we can't allow people to do this because we're actually losing with our own tool. And that's when they clamped it down.